May 13, 1943. The desert sands of Tunisia still clung to their uniforms as nearly 2,000 German soldiers from Rommel's legendary Afrika Korps found themselves standing on the docks of an Algerian port, their war suddenly and decisively over. These were not ordinary prisoners. They were the elite of the Wehrmacht, battle-hardened veterans who had driven British forces back to the gates of Egypt, men who had earned the grudging respect of their enemies through months of brilliant desert warfare. Among them stood Sergeant Friedrich Radke, holder of the Iron Cross, a man who had witnessed the fall of France and survived 2 years of brutal combat in North Africa. As he waited in the makeshift processing centre, watching American efficiency organise thousands of prisoners with mechanical precision, he had no idea that he was about to embark on a journey that would shatter everything he believed about his enemies, his homeland, and the war itself. The processing alone should have been their first warning. American officers moved through the crowds with clipboards and cameras, documenting each prisoner with a thoroughness that exceeded anything the Wehrmacht had achieved even at the height of its power. Identity photographs, medical examinations, inoculations administered by medics who spoke fluent German. Every prisoner received a card explaining their rights under the Geneva Convention, translated perfectly into their native language. The organisation was flawless, relentless, and somehow effortless. These Americans had clearly done this before, and they were very, very good at it. But nothing prepared the Germans for what came next. As they sat in holding areas waiting for transport ships, the food arrived. Not the watery soup and black bread they had subsisted on during the final desperate months in Africa, but actual meals, white bread that was actually white. Real coffee, not the ersatz substitute they had grown accustomed to in Germany. Meat served twice daily. Hans Müller, a tank commander from the 21st Panzer Division, would later write to his mother that he had eaten better in 3 days of American captivity than he had in the previous 6 months of combat. The prisoners assumed this was propaganda, a deliberate attempt to impress them before the real hardships began. They were catastrophically wrong about that too. The Liberty ships that would carry them across the Atlantic were themselves monuments to something the Germans didn't yet understand. These vessels had been built at a pace that defied comprehension, constructed in American shipyards where workers assembled entire cargo ships in less than a week. The Robert E. Peary, which would transport nearly 3,000 prisoners, had rolled off the assembly line in just 4 days and 15 hours. If the Germans had known this fact, they would have dismissed it as impossible propaganda. Ships took months to build, not days. Everyone knew that. The 2-week journey across the Atlantic became a floating classroom in American industrial capacity. The ship's crew disposed of more food waste each day than entire German companies had received in weekly rations during their final months in North Africa. Sailors threw away half-eaten steaks, whole loaves of bread, gallons of milk that had sat too long in the ship's refrigeration units. They did this openly, without thought, not to mock their prisoners, but because such waste was meaningless to them. Their supply chain was essentially unlimited. Lieutenant Colonel Wilhelm von Stauffen, whose Prussian family had served in every German war since Frederick the Great, found himself studying the ship's radar antenna as it rotated above the bridge. This technology, which he believed only Germany and perhaps Britain possessed in limited quantities, was standard equipment on a cargo vessel returning from a routine supply run. The implications were staggering. If the Americans had radar on their merchant ships, what did their warships carry? What did their factories produce? What were they not being told about American technological capabilities? As their ship approached the American coast in early August 1943, the prisoners pressed themselves against portholes and gathered on deck for their first glimpse of their destination. Norfolk Naval Base stretched across the horizon like an industrial city, its docks extending for miles in both directions, massive cranes loading and unloading dozens of ships simultaneously. In a single day, this one port handled more tonnage than Hamburg, Germany's largest port, managed in an entire week. The scale was beyond anything in their experience. Private Johann Weber, a factory worker from the Ruhr before his conscription, counted 47 cargo ships in various stages of loading or unloading. The cranes moved with electric power smoothly and continuously, without the coal smoke that choked German industrial cities. Each crane lifted loads that would have required a dozen men and horses back home. The efficiency was mesmerizing and deeply unsettling, but nothing could have prepared them for the march to the trains. Along the route from the docks, they passed parking lots filled with civilian automobiles, hundreds of them, thousands of them, cars belonging to dock workers, ordinary labourers who drove their own private vehicles to work each day. In Germany, automobile ownership remained a privilege of the wealthy and party elite. The Volkswagen, promised to the German people since 1934, remained exactly that, a promise. Fewer than 1,000 had ever been delivered to civilians. Here, common workers owned cars as casually as they owned shoes. The trains themselves delivered the next psychological blow. These were not the boxcars that had carried German troops across Europe, not the 40 and 8 wagons designed to transport 40 men or 8 horses. These were passenger coaches, Pullman cars with padded seats that converted to sleeping berths, dining cars with white tablecloths and silver cutlery, observation cars with panoramic windows designed for tourists, not prisoners of war. Sergeant Radke would later write that they boarded like holiday travellers, not captured enemies. The American Guard seemed almost embarrassed by the comfort. One sergeant actually apologised that the air conditioning wasn't working properly in their car. Air conditioning? In August? Most of the prisoners had never experienced artificial cooling in their lives. They had assumed such luxury existed only in the personal trains of high-party officials. Yet here it was, standard equipment on a prisoner transport. The 3-day journey from Norfolk to the camps in Texas and Oklahoma would prove more destructive to Nazi ideology than any military defeat could have achieved. As the trains rolled through Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Kentucky, the German prisoners witnessed an America that simply could not exist according to everything they had been taught about their enemies. Every small town blazed with electric lights. Not just the main streets, but residential areas, farms, even rural crossroads. In Germany, blackout regulations had plunged the Reich into darkness since 1940. Even before the war, rural electrification had reached barely 20% of German farms. Yet here, communities that would have been lucky to have a single electric street lamp in Germany displayed illuminated shop windows, electric signs, and houses with lights burning in multiple rooms. The trains passed factories running night shifts, their windows glowing like beacons, parking lots filled with workers' cars even at midnight. Private Helmut Weiss, whose father held a Nazi party position in Hamburg, wrote in a letter discovered decades later that they passed through dozens of cities that first night, and every one of them had more electricity than all of Hamburg combined. When he mentioned this to a guard, the American just shrugged and said they would see for themselves that this was normal, that every American town had enjoyed electric power since the 1920s. In Roanoke, Virginia, the trains stopped for water and coal. The prisoners watched American railway workers perform in 30 minutes, what would have taken 2 hours in Germany. Automated coal loaders filled the tender while electric water pumps refilled the boiler, and mechanized lubrication systems serviced the engine. Every aspect of the operation demonstrated technological superiority that the Germans were only beginning to comprehend. Even more disturbing was the casual wealth of the workers themselves. They wore leather boots that would have cost a German labourer 2 months' wages. They drank Coca-Cola from glass bottles and threw the empties away without thought. They smoked cigarettes continuously, stubbing them out half-finished, a waste that seemed almost criminal to men who had been rationing tobacco for years. Everything about these workers suggested abundance so complete that waste had become meaningless. As the trains crossed into Tennessee and Kentucky, the prisoners encountered American industrial power in full display. Through the windows they watched endless factories, each one larger than anything most had seen in Germany. The Alcoa aluminum plant in Tennessee stretched for 3 miles along the river, its electric furnaces consuming enough power to supply the entire city of Munich. Near Louisville, they passed the synthetic rubber complex where 4 massive facilities produced more rubber in a single month than Germany had managed in its best year, despite having invented the process. The deeper the trains penetrated into America, the more complete became the destruction of everything the prisoners thought they knew about their enemy. They had been told that America was weak, divided, on the verge of economic collapse. They had been assured that American industrial capacity was inferior, hastily built, designed to produce quantity over quality. Every mile of track, every illuminated town, every smoking factory chimney contradicted these comfortable lies. At a brief stop in St. Louis, They crossed the Mississippi River and saw barges carrying more grain than Germany's entire harvest the previous year. Grain elevators lined both banks of the river, each one capable of storing enough wheat to feed a German city for months. The abundance was not just impressive, it was incomprehensible to minds shaped by scarcity and rationing. As their trains finally approached the camps in Texas, the German prisoners sat in stunned silence, watching an endless landscape of prosperity roll past their windows. They had come to America expecting to find a weak enemy on the verge of collapse. Instead, they were discovering an industrial empire of such overwhelming power that their own nation's capabilities seemed primitive by comparison. The war they thought they understood was about to be revealed as something entirely different, and their education in American might was only beginning. Camp Hearn, Texas, built in just 4 months from empty prairie, sprawled across thousands of acres like a small city. As the trains pulled to a stop and the prisoners stepped onto the platform, they found themselves facing something that challenged every assumption they had carried about American prison camps. These weren't the crude barracks they expected, hastily thrown together from scrap materials. These were solid wooden buildings with electric lights, flush toilets, hot water and steam heating systems. Each structure had been built with more quality lumber than the entire German villages possessed. The camp hospital alone would have been impressive in peacetime Germany. Lieutenant Colonel Dr. Friedrich Bauer, chief surgeon of the 164th Light Division, found himself in a medical facility better equipped than most civilian hospitals back home. X-ray machines, surgical equipment, pharmaceutical supplies that had been unavailable in Germany since early in the war. The Americans stocked penicillin freely, this miracle drug that German doctors had only heard whispered about in medical journals. They used it on prisoners for minor infections, medicine so precious that German soldiers were dying for want of basic antibiotics. The camp kitchen became another revelation in American abundance. Prisoners assigned to cooking duties discovered walk-in refrigerators larger than most German apartments, electric mixers that could prepare dough for thousands of men, automated dishwashers, and gas ranges that could cook meals for an entire division. The daily rations included fresh milk, eggs, meat, vegetables, and white bread, in quantities that German civilians hadn't seen since before the war began. Corporal Otto Krebs, who had worked as a chef in Munich before his conscription, found himself throwing away more food each day than his family had eaten in 3 years. Not spoiled food, not scraps, but perfectly good surplus that American regulations required them to prepare in case additional prisoners arrived. The waste was systematic, mandated, and utterly incomprehensible to men who had watched their homeland slowly starve. By September 1943, acute labour shortages in American agriculture led to something unprecedented. German prisoners were trucked daily to work sites across the American heartland, travelling without blindfolds or restricted routes through the very country they had been at war with just months earlier. They saw everything. The endless fields of corn and wheat stretching to every horizon, the factories running 3 shifts around the clock, the shops filled with goods that had disappeared from German stores years earlier, the houses with electric refrigerators and radio sets in every room. At a cotton processing facility outside Houston, Private Herbert Lang watched a single machine handle more cotton in 1 hour than his entire village could have processed in a month using traditional methods. The gin was powered by electricity from rural electrification programs that had brought power to 90% of Texas farms by 1943. The farmer who owned this operation was nobody special, Lang recorded in his secret diary. Not aristocracy, not a party member, just an ordinary farmer. Yet he had electricity, running water, a truck, an automobile, and a tractor that cost more than anything Lang's father had ever owned. In Nebraska, prisoners worked in sugar beet fields that stretched beyond the horizon, each one larger than entire German counties. They watched combine harvesters that could do the work of 100 men, machines so advanced that German agricultural experts would have dismissed descriptions of them as fantasy. The farmers spoke casually of yields that would have been impossible in Germany, 60 bushels of wheat per acre compared to Germany's 30 on the very best land. Private Wilhelm Hoffmann, working on a farm outside Scottsbluff, wrote about the farmer's 16-year-old son who drove a tractor worth more than everything Hoffmann's father had earned in his entire lifetime. When Hoffmann mentioned this observation, the boy laughed and explained that it wasn't even a particularly good tractor. His father was waiting for a newer model from John Deere that would be even more advanced. The most devastating revelations came to those prisoners assigned to work near American factories. While Geneva Convention rules prohibited direct war production work, prisoners could labor in industries that freed American workers for military service. This technicality allowed thousands of German soldiers to witness American industrial capacity up close, and what they saw defied everything they thought they understood about manufacturing. At a Campbell soup factory in New Jersey, prisoners watched production lines process more tomatoes in a single day than most German facilities handled in an entire month. The plant operated with a skeleton crew of women and elderly men, as younger workers had been drafted for military service. Yet production exceeded peacetime levels through automation that seemed almost magical to observers accustomed to manual labor. Everything ran on electricity: conveyor belts, automatic filling machines, steam cookers that processed hundreds of cans simultaneously. One elderly woman monitored controls that managed what would have required 50 workers in Germany. She performed this complex task while listening to radio programs and drinking coffee, multitasking in ways that German industrial organization had never imagined possible. Near Detroit, prisoners unloading coal at power plants gained glimpses of the automotive industry's conversion to military production. The River Rouge complex, visible across the water, employed 100,000 workers producing jeeps, aircraft engines, and tanks. The facility consumed more electricity daily than the entire city of Hamburg. The parking lots alone contained thousands of automobiles belonging to factory workers, ordinary laborers who owned private transportation that German officers could barely afford. By winter 1943, American intelligence officers were documenting something they called ideological collapse syndrome among the prisoners. The accumulated weight of daily observations was producing fundamental changes in how these men understood the world. They no longer argued when shown American production statistics. They had seen too much. Even the most fanatical National Socialists had grown quiet, no longer speaking confidently about German victory or American weakness. The camp newspapers produced by prisoners themselves began reflecting this transformation. Publications that had initially maintained defiant nationalism gradually shifted toward discussions of democracy, economic systems, and post-war reconstruction. The editors found their audiences increasingly receptive to ideas they would have rejected as enemy propaganda just months earlier. Lieutenant Hermann Goetz, captured with the 10th Panzer Division, wrote in a letter that passed American censors without difficulty. They had been told America was weak, divided, controlled by hostile elements, incapable of sustained military effort. Every day spent in captivity revealed the opposite. This was the most organized, unified, and powerful nation on earth. They had been fed fairy tales by leaders who understood nothing about their enemies. The treatment of Italian prisoners after Italy's surrender in September 1943 provided another devastating blow to German assumptions about American character. Italian soldiers who agreed to cooperate were formed into service units, given better quarters, increased pay, and considerably more freedom. German prisoners watched their former allies working alongside Americans, eating in American restaurants, some even forming relationships with American women. The Americans showed no hatred toward men who had been shooting at their soldiers just weeks earlier. This democracy they had been taught to despise appeared more honourable than their own system of alliances. The Italians had switched sides, yet they were treated better as former enemies than they had been as German allies. Christmas 1943 delivered perhaps the most profound psychological impact of all. American organizations, churches, and civic groups sent 500,000 Christmas packages to German prisoners, enemies who had been trying to kill American soldiers just months before. Each package contained cigarettes, candy, toiletries, and games. Local communities invited prisoners to Christmas dinners, though regulations prevented most from accepting these gestures of goodwill. At Camp Herne, the local Methodist church choir performed Christmas carols in German for the prisoners. Women from the town sent homemade cookies and cakes. The Boy Scouts delivered handmade Christmas cards, created specifically for enemy soldiers spending the holiday far from home. This kindness toward men who remained technically at war with America shattered the final remnants of racial theories the prisoners had been taught to believe. Lieutenant Walter Müller, whose brother had died in the bombing of Hamburg, struggled to comprehend this treatment. These Americans knew perfectly well that Germans were their enemies. Many had sons and husbands fighting against German armies at that very moment. Yet they demonstrated genuine Christian charity, not propaganda gestures, but authentic kindness. What kind of people treated enemies this way? Only those absolutely certain of victory and completely secure in their power. The Christmas feast itself defied all comprehension. Turkey, ham, mashed potatoes, gravy, vegetables, pies, ice cream. Quantities of food that Germany hadn't seen since before the First World War. The prisoners ate until they became physically ill, unable to process such abundance being lavished on captured enemies. They consumed meals that would have fed German families for weeks, and they were told this represented a normal American Christmas dinner, the same meal every American family was enjoying that day. If the Americans could feed prisoners this way, the Germans wondered, what must their own soldiers be eating? What resources did this nation possess that allowed such casual abundance even during total war? The mathematical implications were becoming impossible to ignore. America wasn't just winning the production war, it was operating on a scale that made competition meaningless. By early 1944, over 40,000 German prisoners had enrolled in educational programs that would have been unimaginable in their homeland. They studied English, American history, mathematics, and sciences. The University of Chicago provided correspondence courses. Stanford University sent professors to lecture on democracy and economics. The prisoners' thirst for knowledge seemed insatiable once they realized these opportunities were genuine rather than propaganda exercises. These men, who had been told Americans were culturally inferior barbarians, discovered libraries containing millions of books, universities that welcomed students from all social classes, scientific research that led the world in multiple fields. They read American newspapers freely, comparing different viewpoints on the same events, something that had been impossible under the information control systems they had known in Germany. The systematic transformation accelerated as 1944 progressed. German prisoners who had arrived as convinced National Socialists were now writing essays about democratic reconstruction. Officers who had sworn personal oaths to Hitler found themselves planning how to implement American agricultural techniques in post-war Germany. The change wasn't forced through coercion or heavy-handed propaganda, but through simple observation of a system that actually worked. Spring brought expanded labor programs as American production reached its absolute peak. German prisoners worked in canneries, steel mills, and fabrication plants, witnessing industrial capacity that rendered their homeland's efforts almost quaint by comparison. At the Higgins Boat Factory in New Orleans, they watched workers assemble 700 landing craft monthly, each vessel requiring 20,000 precisely manufactured parts. The facility employed 20,000 people, including thousands of women operating cranes, welding hulls, and managing complex production schedules. Staff Sergeant Kurt Zimmermann, who had worked at Krupp before the war, thought he understood industrial manufacturing. But this transcended anything he had imagined possible. The Americans produced more boats in a single month than Germany's entire navy had built in a full year. 3 shifts operated continuously, 24 hours daily, 7 days weekly. Women performed tasks that German industry reserved exclusively for men, operating sophisticated machinery while maintaining production rates that exceeded anything achieved through traditional methods. At Republic Steel in Ohio, prisoners witnessed the daily production of 10,000 tons of steel. The blast furnaces operated without interruption, fed by endless trains carrying iron ore from Minnesota and coal from Pennsylvania. This single facility produced more steel than the entire Ruhr Valley at its absolute wartime peak. Private Paul Hartmann, who had believed German industrial capacity represented the pinnacle of manufacturing efficiency, found himself watching Americans waste more steel through routine spillage than his former plant could produce through maximum effort and extended shifts. The summer harvest of 1944 provided the final demolition of every assumption about American agricultural capacity. German prisoners worked across the Midwest, witnessing grain production that could legitimately feed the entire world. In Kansas, they observed wheat harvests where individual farms produced more grain than entire German provinces. Combine harvesters moved across fields like ships navigating golden oceans, each machine harvesting 100 acres daily while operated by a single person. The grain elevators they filled could store more wheat than Germany imported during complete years. Private Franz Weber, a farmer from East Prussia, calculated that one American farmer using mechanized equipment accomplished the work of 100 German farmers using traditional methods. Aerial photographs showed wheat fields covering thousands of square miles, an agricultural empire so vast that losing half the harvest would still leave surplus exceeding all European production combined. In California's Central Valley, prisoners picked fruit in orchards extending beyond every horizon. They watched perfectly acceptable fruit being discarded for minor cosmetic blemishes, produce that would have been treasured in rationed Germany. Entire crops were sometimes ploughed under to maintain stable market prices, a concept that caused genuine psychological breakdown among men from a hunger-ravaged homeland. Private Otto Schultz wrote about watching mountains of oranges bulldozed into pits because excess production threatened price stability. When news of the Normandy invasion reached the camps on June 6th, German prisoners experienced their final ideological collapse. The scale of Operation Overlord demonstrated organizational capacity beyond anything Nazi Germany had ever contemplated. 6,000 ships, 11,000 aircraft, 150,000 men in the initial wave. The artificial harbours alone represented engineering achievements that German planners would have deemed impossible fantasies. Prisoners watched newsreels of the invasion within days of the landing. They observed endless streams of vessels, supply systems delivering 15,000 tons daily across open beaches, logistics networks that supported armies larger than Germany's entire remaining reserves. They were witnessing their homeland being systematically crushed by the very nation they had been assured was too weak and disorganized to sustain prolonged warfare. Lieutenant Friedrich von Tauben wrote the assessment that captured their collective realization. Everything was lost. Not merely the war, but the entire ideological framework they had believed. Germany had challenged the world's greatest industrial power using fairy tales and racial mythology instead of realistic strategic planning. They had sent horses against trucks, rifles against automatic weapons, courage against unlimited material resources. Beyond the overwhelming display of industrial might, German prisoners experienced something that challenged Nazi ideology even more profoundly: American humanity. Despite propaganda depicting Americans as weak and overly sentimental, the prisoners discovered a people secure enough in their strength to demonstrate genuine mercy toward defeated enemies. When Private Hans Miller received word that his son had died in the Hamburg bombing, the American camp commander personally delivered the Red Cross message and offered sincere condolences. When Lieutenant Paul Fisher's wife wrote describing her struggle to feed their children, American church groups organized food packages for her in Germany, enemy civilians in a nation. America was actively bombing at that very moment. The Americans consistently separated the German people from the Nazi regime, explaining that they were fighting Hitler rather than Germans as a people. This distinction, which had seemed like transparent propaganda, proved authentic through countless daily interactions. They prepared prisoners to participate in rebuilding Germany after the war rather than planning its destruction. Medical treatment particularly affected the prisoners' understanding of American character. German doctors worked alongside American medical personnel, learning advanced techniques while using equipment that would have been available only to elite patients in Germany. Prisoners received surgical procedures that exceeded the care provided to German officers. Mental health treatment, virtually unknown in Wehrmacht culture, was standard practice for traumatized soldiers. Dr. Friedrich Bauer observed that Americans treated attempted suicides through counseling rather than punishment. Prisoners suffering mental breakdowns received professional therapy instead of disciplinary action. This approach to human weakness revealed a strength the Germans had never comprehended, the confidence that came from genuine power rather than manufactured brutality. By March 1945, the secret re-education program had achieved results exceeding every expectation. Over 25,000 prisoners had voluntarily enrolled in democracy courses. Camp newspapers published detailed articles about constitutional government, free market economics, and civil rights protections. Discussion groups debated Germany's future reconstruction using American models as examples. The transformation was so complete that American authorities worried about prisoners becoming overly enthusiastic about American systems. Some requested permission to remain in America after the war ended. Others married American women they had met through approved correspondence programs. Thousands would eventually immigrate to America during the following decade, carrying first-hand knowledge of democratic prosperity back to their families and communities. April 1945 brought the ultimate revelation. As American forces liberated concentration camps throughout Germany, footage was shown to German prisoners in American camps. Many initially refused to believe the evidence, dismissing it as propaganda, but the documentation was overwhelming. Testimony from American soldiers, photographs that couldn't be faked, newsreel footage, and eventually letters from Germany confirming the horrific reality. The psychological impact was devastating beyond anything they had previously experienced. Men who had maintained some residual pride in German honor despite military defeat now faced the complete moral collapse of everything they had fought to defend. They hadn't simply lost a war, they had served a fundamentally evil cause. Staff Sergeant Walter Schmidt wrote perhaps the most honest assessment of their collective realization. They had believed themselves warriors fighting for a great cause, and discovered they were merely tools of criminals. They had convinced themselves they were bringing civilization to inferior peoples, and learned they were the actual barbarians. The Americans they had dismissed as weak and decadent had demonstrated what genuine civilization actually meant. As the European War ended in May 1945, German prisoners faced repatriation with profoundly mixed emotions. They had witnessed an America that contradicted everything they had previously believed. They had eaten better as prisoners than as soldiers, been treated with more dignity by enemies than by their own government, and discovered that prosperity came from freedom rather than conquest. The final months of captivity were spent preparing for return to a destroyed homeland. American authorities provided vocational training, agricultural education, and political instruction designed to help rebuild rather than punish Germany. Prisoners learned about reconstruction plans before they were publicly announced, understanding that America intended to transform rather than eliminate their defeated nation. Lieutenant Friedrich von Tauben captured the essence of this transformation in his final letter from captivity. The Americans had prepared them to rebuild their country through education, skills training, and hope rather than revenge. They had converted defeated soldiers into future democratic citizens through generosity that was incomprehensible to minds shaped by totalitarian vindictiveness. Between 1945 and 1946, over 370,000 German prisoners were repatriated from American camps. They returned to a Germany that was divided, destroyed, and economically devastated. But they carried something invaluable with them: direct knowledge of how democratic industrial societies actually functioned. They had witnessed prosperity, efficiency, and human dignity operating together rather than in opposition. These former prisoners became unwitting agents of transformation in post-war Germany. They possessed practical understanding of industrial methods, agricultural techniques, and democratic principles that proved essential for reconstruction. Many rose to positions of prominence in West Germany's remarkable recovery, bringing American-learned lessons to German institutions and industries. The story of their transformation represents one of history's most successful re-education programs, achieved not through force or propaganda, but through the simple demonstration of what free societies could accomplish. They had arrived as convinced enemies and departed as witnesses to democracy's power, carrying seeds of change that would bloom into one of the 20th century's most remarkable reconstructions. Their impact on post-war Germany extended far beyond individual success stories. Hans Kroll, who had spent 18 months at Camp Shelby, returned to become West Germany's ambassador to the United States, carrying diplomatic credentials that represented a complete reversal of his wartime allegiances. Walter Hallstein, who had taught English classes to fellow prisoners at Camp Como, rose to serve as president of the European Commission, helping forge the very Atlantic alliance his nation had once sought to destroy. Rudolf von Thaden, held at Camp Herne where he had first witnessed American agricultural abundance, became a leader in German agricultural reform, implementing mechanization techniques he had observed on Texas farms. Eduard Ackermann, who had worked in Nebraska wheat fields as a prisoner, revolutionized German farming methods using American efficiency principles that doubled crop yields within a decade. These men didn't simply adopt American techniques, they adapted them to German conditions while carrying forward the democratic values they had absorbed during captivity. The economic miracle that transformed West Germany in the 1950s was built partly on knowledge gained in American prison camps, where former enemies had learned that prosperity flowed from freedom rather than conquest. The transformation proved so complete that by 1955, when the last restrictions on German sovereignty were lifted. Former prisoners were leading the very institutions that would make West Germany America's closest European ally. They had witnessed democracy in action and understood its practical advantages over the totalitarian system they had once served. Major Paul Newland of the Special Projects Division documented this extraordinary outcome in his final report. Without coercion, without traditional propaganda methods, American industrial capacity and democratic values had converted hardened National Socialists into future democratic citizens. The program succeeded because it relied on observation rather than indoctrination, allowing prisoners to draw their own conclusions from overwhelming evidence. The statistics reveal the scope of this transformation. Of the 371,000 German prisoners held in America, fewer than 1% attempted escape, with only 2,200 total attempts recorded across nearly 4 years of operations. 0 prisoners achieved permanent escape. Post-war surveys showed that 95% rated their treatment as good or excellent. Most remarkably, thousands maintained regular correspondence with American families for decades after returning to Germany. In 1985, on the 40th anniversary of the war's end, surviving German prisoners organized a reunion in Austin, Texas. Over 500 former captives returned to America, many bringing their children and grandchildren to show them where their transformation had begun. The gathering represented something unprecedented in military history, former enemies celebrating their captivity as a positive life experience. Former Staff Sergeant Hans Weiss, who had been held at Fort Robinson, and later became a physician in Georgetown, Maine, spoke for many when he addressed the reunion dinner. Life in the American camps had represented vast improvement over conditions most had known in Depression-era Germany. They had discovered running water, central heating, abundant food, and medical care that exceeded what German civilians received even in peacetime. But beyond material comfort, they had discovered dignity. Farmers in Iowa had treated them not as enemies, but as young men far from home, sharing meals, knowledge, and sometimes even their family tables. This humanity from people whose sons were fighting German armies had changed them permanently, replacing hatred with understanding and creating bonds that transcended national boundaries. Former Lieutenant Hermann Goetz, then 78 years old, delivered the keynote address that captured the essence of their collective experience. They had arrived in America as enemies, as National Socialists, as believers in ideological lies. They departed as friends, as Democrats, as men who had witnessed truth in action rather than propaganda on posters. America had demonstrated that genuine strength came from production rather than conquest, from diversity rather than uniformity, from freedom rather than oppression. They had seen the arsenal of democracy operating at full capacity, producing not just weapons of war but the foundations of peace. They had witnessed farmers feeding the world, workers building tools of victory, and citizens treating enemies with dignity that reflected absolute confidence in their cause. Most importantly, they had learned that America's true weapon was not its military hardware, but its inexhaustible capacity for creation and its unshakable belief in human potential. The bombers and tanks were merely products of a system that valued innovation over ideology, cooperation over coercion, and hope over hatred. They returned to Germany with a sacred mission to build a society that could create rather than destroy, that could prosper through peace rather than war, that could compete through excellence rather than eliminate through violence. The Germany that rose from the ashes incorporated lessons learned in American prison camps, where former enemies had been transformed into allies through the simple power of example. The reunion concluded with a standing ovation that lasted nearly 10 minutes. Americans and Germans stood together, former enemies united in recognition of a transformation that had seemed impossible when those first trains rolled into Texas in June 1943. The applause wasn't just for successful rehabilitation, but for proof that even the deepest hatreds could be overcome through patience, generosity, and the overwhelming evidence of what free people could accomplish when they worked together. The magnitude of what had been achieved became clear in the cold statistics that measured both the scale of the operation and its remarkable success. Over 500 camps across 45 states had processed nearly 400,000 Axis prisoners. The infrastructure alone represented an organizational achievement that dwarfed most military operations, with camps constructed in an average of 90 days each, complete with utilities, medical facilities, and educational resources. The prisoners had contributed 14 million man-days of agricultural labor and processed 100 million board feet of lumber, earning wages that totaled $230 million in 1940s currency. They had filled critical labor shortages in 46 states, while maintaining escape rates so low they bordered on statistical irrelevance. The German prisoners who stepped off those trains in Texas in 1943 as hardened enemies of democracy departed America in 1946 as its unwitting ambassadors. They had witnessed something unprecedented in human history, a nation so secure in its power that it could afford to show mercy, so confident in its values that it could transform hatred into understanding through simple demonstration rather than force. America's greatest victory wasn't achieved on the battlefields of Europe, but in the quiet moments when former enemies discovered that everything they had been taught was wrong. The industrial might that stunned them was merely the visible expression of something deeper, the inexhaustible creative power of free people working together. These men returned to rebuild Germany not as a conquered nation, but as living proof that even the most bitter enemies could become allies when shown the overwhelming evidence of what democracy